Welcome, everyone. How we doing? That is not the right window. Welcome to World Building Workshop and Ask Me Anything. World building for modern games, super and supernatural. From Of Gods and Game Masters. Dun dun dun. Let me fix the window capture, which is supposed to be capturing my Google Chrome. I don't know why it's doing something else. Okay, I see why. There we are. That right there is what I intended to have. All right, so one of the first things when we're dealing with world building for a modern game, especially a superhero or supernatural game, one of the obvious first things is that the majority of the history you're dealing with in a modern game set in, our world or a rough facsimile thereof. You think so? All right, let me double check my microphones. Because I have several and it could well be capturing the wrong one. Let me find. Let's try this one. Does that fix it? Is that fixing the audio, Dino? Excellent. Yeah, it was using the default microphone, which I honestly don't know what it is, rather than my up-to-date, relatively decent Yeti. All right, so we're talking about history, right? Because in any setting, you need to know the history of the setting. You need to know where things started. You need to know how they got to where you are. I like to start at the very beginning of things when I'm dealing with world building, as many of you know. In fantasy worlds, etc., I go all the way back to the dawn of time and I go, hey, here are the gods, here is how they created the world, and I start with the mythological background to give a really good foundation for the feel of the setting. Obviously, or maybe not obviously, when you're dealing with a setting that is based primarily on the real world, though a lot of that work has already been done, right? So you're looking at the world as it is, with all of the many, many different varieties of mythologies and explanations of how the world came to be. So a lot of that exists. You have all of world history to draw on. All of what historically happened in the real world can generally be assumed to have occurred in your world as well. But it is important in some situations when you're dealing with superhero and supernatural worlds to know what the truth is in your setting. If there is a truth, if there is a single how was the world created in a super or supernatural setting, you actually probably want to know that. You want to know what the truth is behind all of the stories. You'll want to know, is there just the Abrahamic one God and all the others are false gods? Are all the gods real? If all the gods in your set that we have heard about in the world are real in your setting, what does that mean for how the world was created? How do you figure out what the truth is behind the origins of the world? And this may sound really esoteric, but knowing what the truth is about creation can really inform the nature of the world all the way up to the modern day. If, for instance, it really is the Abrahamic, Christian, Islamic, and Judaic God, and they are the one that created everything, then all the other gods are something else, right? They are possibly lesser beings, possibly just different beings. And that has implications for the nature of magical power and supernatural entities throughout your setting. So when we look back on that, it can be a really good idea to have at least a general idea what you want to start with as the truth of your world. Moving forward, you then have to consider in super and supernatural games, how long have the super or supernatural powers been affecting the world? In many cases, in a supernatural setting, they've existed since the dawn of time. There have always been supernatural things. We've always interacted with gods, demons, fairies, spirits, etc., etc. How that interaction is perceived in your setting, which by default, may well be how it is perceived in the real world. How that interaction is perceived in your setting is important. And it's also important to note the differences between what people believe the supernatural interaction was and the truth. Flipping back over to the superhero setting, by the same note, it is possible that there have been superheroes from the dawn of time as well, and they simply appeared to people as the great heroes and demigods of all the ancient stories, and gods in some cases, all the way, back to Sun Wukong in China, Thor's adventures in all of Norse mythology, Gilgamesh, Enkidu, Heracles, Odysseus, all of these beings that had larger than life abilities across all of the mythology of the world could well have been simply examples of superheroic level characters, wherever it is they got their power. But you can also go with both of these to the other extreme, where superpowers may have just begun to exist. Maybe they started in the 18th century, right? Or maybe they started after World War II. Or maybe even they began last week in your setting, right? It could have been just a recent transition, and suddenly a world that was our own up till now has superheroes. This can even work in the case of the supernatural. An example of that is in sort of like that, right? Because an example of that is like the Shadowrun universe. While it has had magic in the far past, for all of modern history, there's no magic until suddenly in 2012, at the end of the Mayan long count, magic returns to the world and everything changes. That approach can allow you in some ways to do some very cool things, because You can deal with super ancient history, but mostly you don't have to worry about the effects of the magic or the superheroes on recent history. And the world that you are operating in can look more and more like the real world. The more your superheroes and supernatural beings have interacted publicly with the world, the more you have to think about how it has changed that world. And that is kind of the beginning inspiration of what I have on the screen, which is the hidden history of the First Coast. How would you separate magic from superhero beings? Would there be a lot of crossover between the two? Yes, there absolutely would be, especially in the case of, like, my world that needs heroes. The fundamental source of all superpowers in that world is magic, right? It doesn't have to be. You can always have superhero powers come from any number of other sources. But in general, in the majority of superhero settings, magic is at least one of the possible power sources for them. And until modern day, most people wouldn't know the difference between those power sources. Hercules, as the Romans knew him, could well have been a mutant, right? But the people at the time would think of him as a demigod, or empowered by the gods, or given power by magic, right? Those things would be, from their worldview, basically the same thing. Whereas when you get into modern day, the person who was bitten by a radioactive spider, technically, that's a pseudo-scientific explanation for their power. Except, of course, that in some Spider-Man comics, Spider-Man is also chosen as an avatar of the spider spirit and all this stuff. So even on the characters that have scientific backgrounds and explanations, magic gets thrown into the mix on a lot of them. Okay? So the distinction is fundamentally only important to those people who are investigating the sources and the backgrounds. The scientist who's trying to figure out where all these superpowers are coming from, he cares whether this is magic, that's quantum physics, etc., etc. Everybody on the street is going to interpret it in a way that fits with their worldview. If they believe in science, or if they focus on science, then they will think up scientific reasons for it. If they are magically inclined, they will interpret it and explain it via magic, even if the actual source is otherwise, right? But you definitely want to think about the sources for these powers and whether they are scientific, pseudoscientific, magical, divine, etc., or all of the above, especially in a superhero game, right? One of the reasons I have put super and supernatural into the same context is because they have so many of the same fundamental needs in a setting, right? Scion, in which you play the demigod children of gods operating in the modern day, is a superhero game, and it is fundamentally a supernatural game where you're fighting supernatural entities and you get your power from supernatural sources, right? Vampire the Masquerade is fundamentally a supernatural game, but I've seen it played as, well, we're blood-sucking superheroes trying to do good with this evil power that's been given to us. And of course, your standard superhero settings, as I said, tend to have a huge amount of magic in them. Marvel has Doctor Strange, Doctor Voodoo, Doctor Druid, Doctor Doom, all the, if you're magical, there's a good chance your first name is Doctor. But they also have Reed Richards, who has legitimately said he doesn't really believe in magic, despite having seen it. So all of this ties in really interestingly, I think. So back to what I have on the screen here. In the hidden history of the First Coast, this is for one of my worlds that I've been working on for a very long time, for a game system that I'll be working on going forward. This is from the Hidden Folk, and this is just a couple of notes about how the background of the First Coast, i.e. Jacksonville, St. Augustine, etc., on the coast of Florida, which supernatural entities came here and changed the history in the background. In this, I noted, for instance, the first of the hidden folk to arrive in the area is a vampire, one Rodrigo Nunez de Guzman, who accompanied Juan Ponce de Leon. Rodrigo stayed behind when de Leon left and carved out a domain for himself. So in March of 1513, this powerful vampire settled in the First Coast area and started to carve out a domain for himself. In 1562, Jean Ribault, or Ribault, depending on how you want to pronounce it, brought along a French werewolf pack that were descendants of the first Greek werewolf Lycaon. Their alpha is an old werewolf from 11th century Brittany known as Michel Bisclaveret, which is interesting because, of course, that is a folklore werewolf from the mythology and folklore of Brittany. So, when Ribault moved on, the werewolves remained, beginning a long-running feud with Rodrigo and his vampires. In June of 1564, Fort Caroline is established by the French. 13 young dwarves accompanied the expedition and immediately began the delving of new dwarven halls while assisting in construction. Bisclaveret's pack adopted and aided the French in their endeavors, and in 1565, when John Hawkins arrived, his aid to the settlement got him the ultimate reward and the ultimate curse. Bisclaveret bit him, granting him immortality and power as a werewolf. Hawkins' supposed death 30 years later was staged to hide his secret. Hawkins returned to Bisclaveret's pack after his death. Until their defeat by the Spanish, the Fort Caroline settlement would be allied with the local natives and their supernatural cousins. So this is just, as I say, an example of how the history that you develop can interact with the real history. You're going to want to connect some of your historical developments to the supernatural history of the world, or at the very least explain how the supernatural history of the world affected the development of the known or real history. An example for that from the superhero perspective is, if there were superheroes in World War II, why didn't they change the outcome? Why, if the Allies had a huge number of superheroes, did they not just beat the pants off the Axis and defeat Nazi Germany and take out Hitler? And the answer is, there's various different possible answers. One possibly being that in your world, maybe they did. Your superhero world could diverge from real world history at that point if you're willing to do that work. Differing examples of how that's done. In the DC universe, the reason the Allies could not conquer Germany using their superheroes is, one, the Axis had their own superheroes / supervillains, and two, and this is an interesting part where it involves, again, both the super and the supernatural, it is canon that during World War II, throughout most of the war, Hitler had the Spear of Destiny and thus could not actually be beaten on his own ground. It was magically prevented from happening. Until they got rid of the Spear of Destiny, he could not be beaten. In My World That Needs Heroes, they simply countered each other in terms of how powerful their superheroes and supervillains were. It changed individual events, but it did not change the overall outcome of the war. In an example of everything changing the minute superheroes pop up, although it was post-war, post-World War II, I should say, From the moment the alien Dr. Tachyon arrives on Earth in the Wild Cards book series, history changes because of the introduction of superpowered entities. Everything's different. One of the strangest examples is that Fidel Castro never becomes dictator of Cuba. Instead, he becomes a Hall of Fame level pitcher for, I think, the Yankees. But, yeah, when you're thinking of how the superheroic or supernatural events modified the world, one of the decisions you need to make is the decisions you have to make is, what has the supernatural or superheroic world changed about the real world? And the other is, was it all in secret? Did it change things, but nobody in the normal world, or most people in the normal world, don't actually know it? There are clear, like the big comic book creators do address, like in both Marvel and DC, they do address why the war turned out pretty much the same way. The wars that have occurred turned out pretty much the same way, and mostly it's a balance of power. But the Spear of Destiny was a very cool way to explain why they just didn't dodge around the supervillains and go right after Hitler, because they couldn't. All right. But yeah, that's one of many examples of how that works. Now, next time I do this on next Friday, I'm actually going to be getting into the nitty-gritty of a super or supernatural city, which is an entirely, it is, trust me, worthy of a session of its own. All right, we got ads starting in about 5 minutes, just as a warning. So once you have given some thought to the intersection of supernatural and mundane, and what that has changed, you really need to start thinking about, okay, how many kinds of supernatural thing do I have? How many kinds of superheroes do I have? What are the demographics like? How many of each of this kind of thing are in the world, and how are they different, right? Again, the more common the super or supernatural elements, the more likely it is to change your world more fundamentally. If there are, in a city of 2 million people, maybe 100 vampires hiding out in the shadows and being very careful not to be seen, that creates a very different world than if in that same city of 2 million people there are 2,000 vampires and they're not as careful. Or if suddenly there's the risk of a vampiric outbreak and there's going to be 100,000 vampires who will eat their way through the whole city and then become 2 million, etc., etc. That kind of potential is something you have to consider. How easy is it to make new whatever kinds of creatures, right? And how easy is it to destroy them? And how many other supernatural creatures there are out there who might have a vested interest in stopping that from happening? As an example there, in Vampire the Masquerade and Vampire the Requiem, you don't create a vampire just by biting them. So you have to go out of your way to intentionally create a vampire by draining all their blood and giving them some of yours. So they tend to practice careful population control. That's even more the case in my hidden folk setting. They practice very careful population control. In Werewolf the Apocalypse and Werewolf the Forsaken, biting isn't even how a new werewolf comes to be. They're born, at least with the potential, to become werewolves, and then they undergo a spiritual awakening. But there's an indication that there's only can be so many at a time. The universe itself balances their numbers. They don't really have what you would call a ghoul in that setting. They use the word ghoul to mean somebody who's been fed vampire blood and given a certain amount of vampiric power and immortality. But in the world of the hidden folk, vampires can only make each other carefully. Werewolves do, in fact, pass on the curse by biting, but they tend to be very careful, usually not to bite, unless they immediately kill the person they're biting afterward. They use their claws more than anything. Ghouls transfer by being bitten and not killing, or rather, being bitten and then not having the body eaten. It doesn't happen most of the time because ghouls prefer to eat the body, and ghouls are mostly intelligent in the setting because they're based more on the ancient Arabian ghoul or the even older Gula or Gala demon from Mesopotamian myth. But you do have to consider what the populations are and how they are maintained, right? And how they are kept under a certain amount. Because if any of the predatory or parasitical groups, if any of the predatory or parasitical groups get too big, they're going to cause problems. Figuring out how big that is up to you. We are having an ad at the moment, so I am going to just sort of jitter and flip around in my brain for a second while we wait for the ad to be over, because not everybody's on subs. Give me 1 second. Oh. So I suppose our ad break will be up in less than a minute, or about a minute. So that's pretty cool. You got any other questions that I can answer for everybody, Dino, since it looks like you're the only one who can still hear me during the ads? Oh, yeah, no. If, for all intents and purposes, you can make all of folklore be superheroes or supervillains. Depends on the truth and or source of their powers. I mean, the simple answer is yes, and I pretty much do so. I'll get into that in just a second. That's definitely a good question and a reasonable thing to think about. So, for everyone returning, for all intents and purposes, you can make all of folklore, mythology, etc., be superheroes or supervillains, and that depends on the truth and the source of their powers. Yes, if you want, you can go through and decide what every folkloric or mythological entity was for real in your setting, whether it be super or supernatural. You can connect them to different superheroic or supernatural groups. You can, for instance, I have Jack the Giant Killer as a superhero in my world that needs heroes. I have characters empowered by various Yoruba Orisha. I have Magni and Modi, the sons of Thor, one as a superhero, one as a supervillain. I have Megan, the daughter of Thor, as a superhero, right? And that's just in the superhero setting. You get over there to the supernatural settings, and your folklore and your mythology is the single best source of ideas for new monster types, for background ideas and stories. For me, as you're, almost certainly aware, the intersection of gaming and mythology is really where I live. So for me, mythology, folklore, the rest of it is some of the most fertile ground for all gaming. Like, if I can't think of something new and different to make, even for D&D, much less superheroes or supernatural settings, then I find a folktale or a ghost story or something that's been told, especially if it's been told for a long time, because if it's stood the test of time, then it's got a fundamentally good story hook to it and will resonate with larger amounts of people. I have on my website right now just tons of stuff like that. Like in my GURPS section, I've got stats for the Ballybog and the Coup de Vain from Irish myth, Mine Kobolds from Germanic and Dutch myth. I've got the Upir from Slavic myth, Erdhen from medieval folklore, the Totenkopf spider from Germanic folklore, etc., right? So I would say that the folklore and mythology is, just the pretty much the coolest and most inspiring place to look for inspiration, right? But again, that's just me. Not everybody looks at the world that way, but you absolutely can. Especially for my world of Barrow, or sub-world of Barrow. Technically, it's sort of part of the world that needs heroes. That is super, super much the direct intersection between super and supernatural, because it's superheroes in a horror setting where, sure, there are supervillains, but there are also tons of vampires, werewolves, supernatural foes, etc., as the primary problems that they deal with. Very much Blade meets Batman, Gotham meets Ravenloft. And at this point, I'm going to be waiting till next year after they've put out the updated version, or maybe, time it for the updated version of Mutants and Masterminds 4th edition, because they are putting out a 4th edition of Mutants and Masterminds, and I want to be up to date with it before I go to print. Or print. I don't even know if it'll ever get printed because I'm going to try to get it to a, backer kit or Kickstarter or something like that. But the thing, I guess, the thing I want to stress about when you are going to folklore and mythology for your inspirations is do your research. You can absolutely start with Wikipedia. It is not actually a bad source. But if you want the stories to be faithful to their source material and respectful of the cultures you're taking them from, and this for me comes down to every bit of world building, because almost everything you make is going to come from someone's culture. We like to say, okay, this is original to me, but there's not really anything original, and it's better to know what your sources are and respect them than it is to try to pretend that you came up with it all on your own, especially when it comes to specifically cultural items. You can start on Wikipedia, but do deeper research. Follow back the sources that the Wikipedia lists. Go to things like sacred-texts.com for many of the original mythological stories to find what the stories actually are. Take them in with a critical eye. Look at what stories were retold and by whom to see what their biases may have changed about it. If all of your sources for ancient mythology come from the Victorian age or slightly before, then you're going to get a very patriarchally tilted view of them and be very wrong about many things. If all of your sources about, for instance, Egyptian mythology came from the Victorian era, then you think that Set is an evil snake god. If all of your sources simply go through D&D and White Wolf, then you think that Set is an evil snake god because he was portrayed that way by Robert E. Howard in Conan, who got it from a misunderstanding that was made during the Victorian era. D&D picked it up because Conan greatly influenced D&D, and White Wolf picked it up because they'd been gamers from the start, and that's where they got the majority of their knowledge. When in point of fact, given proper research, Set has nothing to do with snakes. He actually fights the black snake Apophis, the snake of chaos, to protect Ra when Ra goes through the underworld at night. So the understanding of characters and folklore, if you really want to be able to use them in a respectful way, make sure you research them more deeply than just what the pop culture understanding of them is, because there's a good chance the pop culture understanding of them is wrong. And while that may not matter for hugely for extremely old, possibly dead practices, it might, right? A lot of these practices are returning in the modern day, and we need to be as respectful of them as we are of any others. Now, that is not to say that you cannot take the inspiration from those, again, trying to be respectful, and then add your own twists. Go, well, the truth was blah, because the folklore said this, it wasn't accurate. That can be very cool, and is something I would recommend. Put your own stamp on each of the supernatural types of creatures, each of, what actually happened versus the folklore of what happened and why it was different, right? Maybe the stories of vampires burning in the sunlight were all propaganda by the vampires so that people would think they were completely safe during the day, and that you could just expose a vampire to the sun and kill them giving the vampire a chance to escape. In point of fact, something like that is the case in the Hidden Folk. Vampires are not vulnerable to sunlight. Some of their powers don't work in sun, but they don't burn. What a lot of people don't realize, because they've been inundated with the pop culture version, and I mean the entire pop culture version, is that the first indication we have of Western vampires burning in sunlight was in the movie Nosferatu, when it first came out in the 1920s. Before that, vampires don't burn in sunlight. Dracula does not burn in sunlight. He walks around in the sun in London all through the book and in the movies. Carmilla does not burn in the sunlight. Ruthven does not burn in the sunlight. Yes, try to find the beginning of the myth's history, use history and known perspectives, twist it, but be respectful of where it's from, because it does have connections to people's cultures, right? Mythology and folklore tells us a whole lot about a people, what they once believed, what they currently believe. It can tell us what's important to them. Because if it's important, there are some big folklore stories about it. But the other reason that the folklore and the mythology are such a fertile and fantastic source for our gaming stories is, again, these are tried and true. These are tested themes and stories. These are things that have had resonance enough throughout the years to be maintained in a culture's lexicon of stories. That already says that they vibe with more people than the ones that stopped getting told. One of the things that we're definitely going to talk about more on Friday, but I wanted to talk about a little bit, is what things about our current world, as they really are partially explained secretly by the supernatural entities in the background. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it becomes refreshing because some of these stories haven't been heard for such a long period of time. That's true. And I think it's unfortunate, because one of the things we get in modern day is a lot of self-referential, okay, well, I'm going to tell this variation of this pop culture story rather than going back to the original material, so that we get this development where in all of pop culture, vampires burn in the sunlight, and people think that that is a standard part of vampire mythology, right? Same thing with silver bullets. Silver bullets killing werewolves. It might have started with the Beast of Gévaudan in France, but that's pretty late in werewolf lore, and it wasn't broad or widespread until the movie The Wolfman. Which is interesting, because silver has always been kind of an anti-monster weapon. You look at The Witcher, which is really good about going back to older stories and bringing them into the modern day. And you see that silver works on most monsters because of the association between silver and purity, which is kind of interesting, given that silver's got antibacterial properties and antibiotic properties, and who knows? Maybe the reason silver hurts vampires and werewolves is because it kills whatever the pathogen is that gives them their powers. If you want to go scientific with it, right? Silver could be killing these monsters because their monstrousness is an infection that the Silver is fighting against. Which is kind of a neat idea. But yeah, each different culture you allow to inspire and influence the world you're building for a supernatural game, I think enriches the whole thing. But it, again, absolutely not required, right? You can have an interesting and cool world in a modern game that is entirely based on more recent takes. Yeah, exactly. That's it's one of the possible ways to look at why it works. Physically, medically, and probably spiritually, all separate. And then, of course, there are the lunar associations between Silver and the Moon. And you can use whichever one of these explanations you think is the coolest for your setting, and possibly different people use different explanations. But the overall theme that you're looking at when you're world building for a modern game is what is the truth and what is the lie. Modern games tend to be much more about things like conspiracies and hidden villains and organized crime and things happening in the background, right? A lot more modern games have you not necessarily everything out in the open that's going on. Whereas when you go further back in like classic fantasy, everybody knows there's a freaking dragon and the adventurers go up to fight him and they know why, right? Whereas if a dragon existed in the modern day, and the modern day hasn't been hugely changed by that fact, it's because the dragon is secret. The dragon is hidden. So, if you want to get to a modern day that mostly feels like the real world, then a lot of the super and supernatural events of the world were probably hidden. The super powered technology and the magical powered technology, if you're in Mage the Ascension, for instance, are not going to be available to the common folk. They're not, maybe not even be usable by common folk, because if everybody could use an Iron Man suit or a flying car or, you know, your Omni Blaster, then why hasn't that affected the overall technology level of the planet? Why isn't everyone, you know, why are we not already out at Neptune if the X-Men can go to the Shi'ar Imperium? Why are we not already dancing across the dimensions if the Fantastic Four can make a portal to go to another dimension? Why has that not affected our technology? If the Avengers can time travel and they have so much science to get to the point of time travel, why has that not changed anything in basic society? You need to think about why that is if you want your world to hang together. Now, it is perfectly okay. Don't misunderstand me. It is perfectly okay not to worry about that kind of thing. There are a lot of people out there who just want to go and kick villain butt, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if you want depth and not realism, because I don't believe in that, but verisimilitude, if you want it to feel real and allow your player characters or your readers or whoever to really connect with it, the more grounded it is, the better. So that when the fantastic elements do come along, as long as they are internally consistent, they have more impact than if everything was magical or fantastic, right? So having an idea, at least a vague idea in your head of why things haven't changed is super important. Or go the other route and do the really hard work of creating an AU where the introduction of these things did change the world, where the introduction of these things made, for instance, because only the Nazis had Übermensch during World War II, they won, and now the entire planet is a fascist Nazi regime with super high tech and mechs and supervillains and almost no good guys, right? That could be a really interesting world to run in, and is an, but it would also be hard to run in as like the primary world. It's more interesting in some cases to have that be, Earth X, the world next door, the other world that you go to fight them and then come back to your more normal world. But you can totally run a modern game in such an alternate universe where everything has changed. Yes, that is always my philosophy. It is easier to improv. It is easier to determine what will happen next, the better you have designed the world. Always be world building instead of always be prepping. I very rarely have to do a lot of prep for individual sessions other than, okay, I need this specific stat block that I don't have yet, right? Most of the time I don't need that because I've already prepped it. I've already designed the world. I know what the stat block is for the major bad guys. I forgot to make an orc with an axe. Whatever. Easy to throw together. If you don't know the capabilities of your BBEG right off the bat, though, you can't even plan for them. And if you can't plan for your BBEG, what are they even doing? Right? So for me, the more you know about your world and how it fits together and its history and the reasons why for things, the more easily you can figure out what happens next, right? I think that's super important for world building in general, world building in general, even more so for world building in modern games, because cause and effect becomes so much more quickly complicated and so much more broad and widespread because of the advent of ease of communication across the world, right? If in a medieval village 5 people come across a vampire, right, and they kill the vampire, those 5 people may tell other people about vampires. But there's 5 people telling you about vampires. It's word of mouth. It's hearsay. It becomes a story very quickly. If those 5 people in modern day live stream their vampire hunting to the world, and thousands of views later, everyone knows there are vampires, or a huge number of people are screaming, look at how it's doctored, but then people actually evaluate the tapes or whatever and find out that it's not doctored, and this group is screaming that it is, and this group is screaming that it isn't, and after a few more of those come out, your masquerade or whatever is freaking gone, right? So the potential immediate effects on the whole world can be a lot higher in a modern day game. Yeah. And from my perspective, if you're running a game with a worldwide conspiracy of silence for anything, vampire, werewolf, My Hidden Folk Compact, whatever, be prepared to run the world when that conspiracy of silence breaks. Be prepared to see what happens when True Blood happens. Because True Blood is a setting where there are vampires and werewolves, etc., who are secret until the point of they're not. Same thing in the Anita Blake vampire series. They are secret until suddenly they aren't, and the world changes to account for it. It's the same thing in The Hollows. It's the same thing in Mary Gentry, also by Laurel K. Hamilton. Be prepared. From my perspective, you should be prepared for that shit to get out, because a lot of the people who are focusing on the cover-ups are so old, they don't understand how things can get blown out of proportion, how quickly information can get out. And, you can take a look at that in terms of real world politics. How am I handling that in Hidden Folk? Wait and see. Because I'm going to have two different source books, one for Hidden Folk and one for the near future, called Unhidden, which is a pseudo cyberpunk setting with the hidden after the Hidden Folk have become not hidden anymore. How that happens, I don't know, because it depends on how that happens through play for various groups and games. But yeah, I really need to get back to getting the tiers system finished so I can get to actually getting to the point of a Kickstarter for the tiers system and for the Hidden Folk world. All right, so in about a minute, ads are going to start, and I think that is a great time for me to take my halfway break. So I'm going to take 10-15 minutes, go to the bathroom, have a cigarette, get some more coffee. I suggest everyone else do the same. I really appreciate everybody being here, whether you are lurking or whether you are interacting. Thank you very much, Dino, for chatting with me. Anybody who can, if I interest you, give me a subscription or go and look at my stuff. Man's got to eat and try to feed his family, and I honestly, I don't do anything else. I'm professional in this space. All right, guys, see you in 15. Well, hello. All right, so hello, Dino. Hello, everyone else, and welcome back to World Building Workshop and Ask Me Anything. World building for modern games, super and supernatural. I am Jack Kellum, Jack of Tales, Jack Gogsbane, Jack the Giant Killer, etc., etc., and this is presented by Of Gods and Game Masters. All right, all that nonsense out of the way. So, Dino, thank you very much for bringing up what you did about the hidden supernatural being very different from the world that we all see, because I have an entire setting based on that concept, which I think is kind of neat. It's also a little Matrix inspired. It is called Leaving the Cave. In the near future, a small band of elite freedom fighters fights for the fate of the world against a vast and vile conspiracy. On the surface, the world looks much like our own, but underneath, I originally wrote this a few years ago, so the near future is 2024, so last year. Man has not ruled his own destiny for more than a century. Hopefully you can see it on the screen. Man has not ruled his own destiny for more than a century. In early 1914, an unprecedented alliance between the vampire nations and the soulless machine collective brought the world firmly under control. Traitorous mages working with the mind control specialists of the collective and the strongest of the vampire lords set in place a mighty spell. This spell affects 99% of the humans on Earth. 99%. It's not very visible. It doesn't seem very clear, but whatever. Okay. Hiding the strange and inexplicable from their eyes, allowing them to believe they live in a world ruled by reason, a world where magic isn't real, where humans make their own decisions. We call this the lie. A werewolf, most often an elite assassin for the nations, could shapeshift in public in full view of hundreds, and maybe, just maybe, one person would see it. He could kill anyone he pleased, and the crowd would see a drive-by, or a mugging, or a wild animal attack, or nothing at all. The sun has been hidden from the world by an overclouding, protecting vampires from destruction, allowing them to walk in full daylight. But the lie makes normal people see the cycle of day and night they have always expected. The heroes of this world have had their eyes opened and learned to disbelieve the lie. These elite empowered people, called philosophers in reference to Plato's The Cave, see the world as it is. They fight killer androids, transforming robots, vampires, werewolves, and evil wizards for the safety and freedom of humankind. Science fiction, horror, and dark urban fantasy. So as you can see, this pretty specifically addresses that hidden truth, right? And it's partially inspired by The Matrix. It's partially inspired by Blade, the first movie, because at one point in that movie, Blade says, "The world you know is a candy-covered topping. There is another world beneath it." And that is the concept, right? Is that the monsters are out there. They rule this world, and they have specifically and intentionally hidden this truth from everyone. And those that have learned the truth are empowered by that fact, because becoming aware of the magical nature of the world allows them to begin to channel magic into their abilities. So the philosophers, as I call them, are effectively low-level superheroes doing, Matrix-style fighting and stuff like that, surpassing their human limitations because they realize that those too are a lie. And that is, as I say, kind of an example of one way to approach the hidden nature of reality and the keeping of the conspiracy. If you have a magical effect or something like it that actively prevents people from knowing the truth and keeps people from seeing it, then you don't have to worry all of a sudden near as much about what we were talking about before, the 5 kids live streaming whatever's happening, because literally no one sees it unless they already know to see it. What the kids live stream is them breaking into some poor old dude's house and driving a stake through his heart, and he just seems like a normal dude, and they're the villains. So that live streaming just becomes evidence at their trial. It's definitely a dark and vicious world. But again, that kind of perspective is inspired by the Matrix, because from the perspective of the normal people in the normal world, all of the heroes of the Matrix are terrorists and are treated as such. That would be the same situation with philosophers here. If people know about them at all, they believe them to be insane terrorists trying to destabilize society, doing bad things to people for no apparent reason. Which is makes it a really hard thing to be a philosopher, to see the truth and not be able to tell anyone. You can't lead other people out of the cave, after all. Except every now and then. By luck, perhaps. So, building off that, when you are building a world for supernatural events specifically, not necessarily superheroes, where the various events tend to be big, larger than life, and above board, because when Galactus comes down and threatens to eat your planet and there is stopped by the Fantastic Four, everybody knows that happened. That changes stuff. When New York is invaded by Chitauri, that has effects. We see that in the MCU. We see how the normal people of the world start reacting to these superheroic events, right? So when you are dealing with a world where these events happen, you must either figure out why people don't know about it, or figure out what reactions they have had to it. And again, that can be a lot easier when you're dealing with a world that up until now has been identical to ours, and whatever mystical or superheroic actions there have been in the world have all been in the distant past, or hidden, or just considered to be myth because you didn't have visual how the powers that be hid the truth and cemented the lie is an important question to ask, because if these things have always been extant, then prior to mass communication, they still could have been considered not real, because humanity tends to not, at least in modern day, believe the out there explanations of things. They're looking for some rational explanation, so they're easy to fool. But once mass communication gets out there, you've got to think either your world is going to change now that there are superheroes and people have seen them and they're public, or something is keeping that from happening intentionally. Could be a spell, could be all of the governments working in tandem to keep it secret, whatever. But at that point, you have another layer of interesting possible foes, right? Say in a supernatural game, you are playing the vampires, and you want to keep the secret of vampires. One of the major things that's going to happen is when that fails, especially in World of Darkness or similar settings, other entities will step in and cover it up as well. But you don't want them to do that, because when they do, they very often destroy everyone who was involved in the breach. Right? In Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition, the Second Inquisition exists, and they are actively going around hunting vampires and werewolves and mages, but also helping to cover it up from normal people. In that same world, because it's still the same world as Mage the Ascension, even though Mage the Ascension doesn't have a 5th edition yet, the magical group called the Technocracy, which is what taught everyone that science and rationality were the truth, go around eliminating anything that would convince people that magic is real. They do have power over them, right? Like, they go for the elimination angle when it gets too far. A lot of the time, they will just put pressure down and go, we're going to fuck you up if you don't keep it quiet. But the Second Inquisition wants to destroy them because they're also just anti-monster. They're anti-vampire. They're anti-werewolf. And one of the really interesting things about that in the World of Darkness setting is that they're not wrong to be so. While your player characters may be vampires or werewolves, and from their own perspective, they're the protagonists, they're still monsters. Vampires still drink people's blood and lose control and kill people. Werewolves kill innocent people while they're defeating the forces of corruption and pollution because they were in the way, or they saw something they shouldn't have, or the werewolf lost their temper, right? The monsters are still monsters, and even the wizards, the mages, the ones who are technically still human, they are still a threat to humanity, which is because the world they want, that is still ruled completely by magic, is horrifically dangerous for all the people who can't do magic. One of the reasons the Order of Reason popped up, which later turned into the Technocracy, is so they could make a more stable world for average humanity to live in. But of course, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, so now they're just another fascist regime stamping down every deviant because of the threat to their power. But arguably, they are as much or more the good guys than the wizards who want magic everywhere, which then leaves normal people vulnerable to them at all times, and magical monsters popping up that only the mages can deal with, right? The magical world they want to live in is horrifically dangerous and painful for normal people to live in. Now, they like to say in Mage that they want everyone to awaken and everyone to be magical, but most of them don't actually want that. And it's not clear if it's even possible to awaken everyone. Only some people seem to have the ability or the spark. Like my philosophers in Leaving the Cave, only some people can look past the lie. So that's one of the perspectives to take on the large scale worldwide is, again, if the superheroes or supernatural, because you can have a world where even the superheroes are secret, right? Or the truth of superheroes is secret. You've got to decide whether in your modern game, the super aspect, whether it be superhero or supernatural, whether it is public or secret. If it is secret, then there are conspiracies, and conspiracies can be a lot of fun. And then, even if it isn't secret, even if superheroes exist, there will still be plenty of conspiracies. Think about organizations like Hydra, right? What is Hydra but a worldwide conspiracy to control the planet? What is Advanced Idea Mechanics? What is Cadmus in DC? What is Argus in DC, keeping eyes on all the superheroes? What is S.H.I.E.L.D., right? You've got all this potential for organizations that operate around the superhuman or supernatural and want to control the narrative of what the superhuman or supernatural means for the world, right? You need to think about what new laws or new perspectives on laws will affect the superhumans or the supernatural beings. Right. There's going to be tons of that. Look at the way mainstream media in DC covers certain things versus what Lex wants you to believe. Right? Look at how many media outlets cover Spider-Man versus what J. Jonah Jameson says about Spider-Man, and which one is believed and what they're trying to do. There are always going to be people who look at even the most heroic of the heroes and go, what are they hiding? What is their actual secret intent? Right? Does Superman have a super harem? Did he come here to conquer the planet? Or is he just an existential threat to human free will because of his ability to intervene in everything, whether or not he's a good person? Right? Consider in super and supernatural settings, from superheroes to vampire to scion especially, what is your moral what is your moral requirement, right? What does having power require you to do or not do? We are, most of us, familiar with the Spidey quote, with great power comes great responsibility, from Uncle Ben, right? We are familiar with how Clark Kent was raised to use his powers to help people by Jonathan and Martha. But one of the things that good superheroic fiction, and thus good superheroic or supernatural gaming needs to address is, what is it moral to do with those powers? What is it moral to not do? We are on an ad break, so I'm not going to get it hugely deeper into anything at the moment, but I think you see what I'm saying, right? It's very much questionable what we should and shouldn't do with the powers we have, if we have powers, right? It seems like a super difficult question sometimes. What should we intervene with? Right. And just because they have that quote, does it mean we can always expect them to follow it? Do we have a good reason to trust them to do what's right with that power? And if not, what the heck can we do about it? How do we stop them? There's almost nothing out there, very few things out there in those universes that can stop someone like Superman, right? And when you try, because he's universally beloved, you become the villain. Now, I'm not saying you're wrong to be the villain. The whole point of Superman is that he has supreme power and uses it for good, right? The whole point of Superman and Spider-Man is that they are the good person doing the best they know how with great power, right? That's why Superman and Spider-Man are basically the superheroes. More than anybody else, Superman is the superhero, the original, and Spider-Man is one of the most popular superheroes of all time because they're just good dudes and they're trying to do the best they can. But even with that, in the superhero and supernatural worlds that we're looking at here, we have to understand what that means. What doing the most good is. What we can and can't intervene in. Right? I haven't seen the new Superman movie. I want to. I'm definitely interested. I know it's going to be good. But I know he intervenes in a war. And there's a lot of backlash about it, right? He looks at it and sees it as absolutely correct to save as many lives as possible. But he never considers the potential political ramifications and how the rest of the world is going to view it. And maybe he shouldn't, right? Probably he shouldn't. If you know you're doing good and the only thing keeping you from doing good is possibly public backlash, then you're not doing good. As Captain America once said, sometimes you have to plant your feet beside the river of truth and say to the whole world, no, you move. But does the very fact of having that power give you both the responsibility, with great power comes responsibility, and the right to dictate those things to other people? Does the very fact of you having supreme superheroic or supernatural power allow you to police other people simply because you have that power? You're not elected, you're not empowered by the people or the state. But you have the power, so how can you not use it? But does that give you a right to use it? And at what point? What things that you're doing are unequivocally correct? And what happens when you try to do the right thing and make the wrong call? So when I will absolutely talk about the new Superman movie once I've seen it. I absolutely will. I will probably talk about it from a world building perspective, because I've seen a lot of the Marvel movies and I'm really interested to see how this new version of DC gets into it. So I will absolutely talk about the new Superman movie from the world building perspective and the perspective of the other things I'm talking about here. Probably have its own its own special edition Superman and world building kind of thing, right? But that's one of the questions that people like Lex Luthor bring up, right? What gives Superman the right to do all this? What gives Batman the right to go out and break the law at least in many versions of himself, in order to enforce the law? What justifies unilateral vigilante justice? What justifies not doing unilateral vigilante justice if you have the capacity to do so and you know you're right? What happens when you knew you were right and then find out you weren't after you've dished out some vigilante justice? Which happens all the time in the comic books, right? These are all the sorts of things that you can keep in mind and consider while you're building your world for a superheroic or supernatural game. You're going to want to consider how the public will react to each of the events that occur in your game, and how that will be affected by people trying to spin it, because someone is always trying to spin events to get a specific result. For superhero worlds and supernatural worlds where the supernatural creatures are out in public, you need to consider the laws that have been written specifically to handle superpowered or supernatural entities. True Blood is another example of this, right? There are specific laws on the books about vampires and how they're allowed to interact with people, right? And the other supernatural creatures are still trying to remain when the heroes don't go out and save the day because they've been made to look bad and they're afraid of it getting worse or whatever. But also, like I was talking about, the laws, all the other supernatural creatures in True Blood are still trying to remain hidden. Vampires are out in public. There's specific laws covering them. In the Anita Blake Vampire Slayer series, Vampire Hunter series, vampires and werewolves and all these things are publicly known. It isn't 100% clear when they became publicly known, but it is known when a law was passed making them legally people. And then what laws were passed that are different for them, because they discovered that they couldn't put them in prison for crimes. So now they have licensed vampire executioners who, the minute a judge says, yes, they're a threat, the licensed vampire executioner is given a warrant to go kill them, not arrest them, because they cannot safely be kept in jail. So you have to consider what the rules are that will be changed to be different for your superheroic and supernatural people. Is it legal for a superhero to testify in court without taking their mask off when legally everyone has a right to face their accuser? Is it legal for superhumans to intervene and do superheroics as a vigilante just because they have these powers? Or are the grand majority of superheroes literally operating outside the law? Now, keep in mind, the interesting thing about that is we have vigilante laws on the books in most places. As long as you're just doing the standard superhero patrol thing that Spidey and Batman do, you can intervene and stop crimes in progress. Anyone is legally allowed to do that in most places, right? But you have to use proportional levels of violence to do so. But you cannot do long-term police investigation and find the bad guy, right? You can't break into their house and arrest them. You can only stop them in the middle of a crime. And generally, it's more accepted if you stop them in the middle of a crime that has the potential for or is actively causing harm to another person, because you are always allowed the right of self-defense and defense of another person. Technically. Although you can still be taken, you can still be arrested for it and charged. It just may end up being thrown out in court, right? And outside of those laws, which again, in a world where the supernatural is well known, it applies just as well as in a superheroic world. Outside of those laws, how do the cops feel about you? Do they think, I love this guy, he makes our job easier? Or do they think, how dare this motherfucker be involved in our business? How dare he go after these people? How dare he, he grabbed 2 of my confidential informants. He busted up an undercover dude. He caught the dirty cop. They handle that in Daredevil Reborn, right? How do the cops feel about a superhero who catches dirty cops? How do the cops feel about superheroes who fight the dirty cops? There's a lot less of a need for police officers for a lot of reasons. We're not going to get into that right now, but how about a world, and this is one that's really scratching an itch for me recently. In my world that needs heroes, the Vanguard and large numbers of heroes are official officers of the law. They are sanctioned by the state to handle super-powered crime because they know the normal cops can't handle it, right? There are still people that operate outside the law, but a large number of the heroes, like every major city has their hero team that may or may not be associated with the Vanguard that is legally sanctioned and is straight up both law enforcement and rescue workers. It's how they're set up. They are official first responders to anything, especially superheroic crime. But flipping back to Leaving the Cave and other worlds like it, and now the police officers are or at least partially the enforcement arm of, whether they know it or not, the enforcement arm of a system that has been corrupted to serve entirely the evil supernatural forces. And the heroes then become outlaws, vigilantes who are seen as terrorists, as we were pointing out. What Owen Casey Stevens calls that, and I'm not sure when the term was coined, but I do like the term. Owen Casey Stevens calls that superpunk. It's like cyberpunk. You're fighting against the corporations and the system and the cops, but with superpowers instead of cyberware. And there are probably some superpowered police officers and enhanced police officers and police officers with super tech. And then, of course you've got your big, like in The Boys, you've got your big Vought corporation working with the U.S. government, et cetera, et cetera. So you got your government supers and your police supers. But the heroes of the setting, because the setting is inherently known, the government is inherently known to be corrupt, the heroes of the setting are actually the outlaws. Superpunk. That's something I'm working on for another Mutants and Masterminds / superhero setting. To a certain extent, Barrow is already there, because Barrow, even though it's technically part of the world that needs heroes, is horrifically corrupt the same way Gotham City is, and is controlled by the supernatural evils. So again, in that setting, your street level heroes are outlaw vigilantes. So it's kind of gothic horror superpunk, which is kind of a really interesting intersection, I think. But we'll see if people think it's an interesting intersection when I try to put it on, one of the crowdfunding things and see if I get any money for it. But yeah, it's really, again, with the broad brushes, the things you have to think about in your world are how superpowers or supernatural creatures are perceived. Oh, absolutely. In any setting that looks on the surface like the modern setting, you may need to ask more questions than if it's a generic fantasy world, because the generic fantasy world has all these baked in assumptions. But if somebody's making a superheroic or supernatural setting in the modern world and they're doing their due diligence, then it's complicated, because the world is complicated. The world is bigger. There are more people. There are more factions. There are more situations. And yes, every step can be filled with landmines. You made the decision that, hey, this is super cool. I'm going to look a little funky and scary, but I save people. Oh no, you look just a little too weird. And now people have decided that your character, who got his power by being bitten by a radioactive spider, is actually diabolic because he just looks too inhuman. Right? Or people decide that if you were born with superpowers, you're evil. Now, don't get me wrong. Mutants in Marvel, because they're actually an analogy for almost any marginalized group, the bigotry toward them doesn't actually make sense, and it doesn't have to. But how many people are going to be bigoted toward metahumans in general, regardless of where they got their powers? Because they are different, more powerful, weird-looking, dangerous. Especially if there are more supervillains than there are superheroes, which usually there are. Are they wrong to be scared? Are they wrong to be worried about the superhero who leaves people webbed up with little bites on their neck and missing some blood for the police to grab? You know, looking at a Spider-Man who's maybe a little more influenced by the spider than Spider-Man is. So there are a lot of levels that influence public perception. And in a lot of cases, the way superpowers manifest can very much be part of that. And then when you get into the obvious, I think, situations where there are big organizations that are metahuman supremacist, then normal people have every reason to be freaking terrified, especially when, and here's the hard part, right? Unlike a white supremacist or a black supremacist or a whatever insert race or ethnic supremacist or religious supremacist in our world, where there's no legitimate argument to be made for them being better. Metahumans have superpowers. They are stronger, faster, better, sometimes smarter. In the world of the boys, even a baseline soup is stronger, faster, better in every way, plus whatever their particular power is. It's hard to argue with them about them being quantifiably better. The problem is that quantifiably better has nothing to do with moral superiority or moral equality or legal superiority or equality, and cannot be allowed to do so. Everyone must correct. Homelander comes into play. Everyone, for a society to be fair, it's liberty and justice for all, not just liberty and justice for everybody who's powerful, or liberty and justice for everybody who's got money, or liberty and justice for everyone who meets these, whatever these benchmarks are to be this, that, or the other thing. And the only way for that, for liberty and justice for all to exist, is if the laws treat everyone equally. I think it's probably pretty obvious that in the world we actually live in, they do not, and thus we are not. But it also doesn't have anything to do with anyone who's actually better. disturbingly. Primarily, it's just rich. Are you rich? So, back to like the beginning of what I started with here. Knowing where the supernatural or superheroic history interacts with or changes the real history is part of what gets you to what your modern day looks like and how the superheroes and or supernatural creatures are treated if they are in fact not secret. And that gives you the background to understand why superheroes and supernaturals and their subgroups might be treated in certain ways. If superheroes were a big reason we won World War II, and superheroes were very patriotic for a long period of time, and superheroes were hyped up as this big awesome thing, then in America at least, most people are going to love most superheroes. But if the superheroes are fighting the establishment and fighting the corruption and calling out the media and etc., the superpunks are going to be portrayed as terrorists and criminals, and legitimately they are criminals, let me be clear, because criminal isn't a moral judgment, it just means you broke the law, right? The law is not moral, the law is just what the law is. Morality does not enter into it nearly often enough. But all of what I talked about in this episode leans into the final picture of what you've got, right? Was it secret? Is it secret? How was the secret kept? How were the first people to break the secret or become public? How did they interact with the world? That will greatly influence it, right? If your first superheroes were the Fantastic Four, then that's going to give a more positive outlook on superheroes than if your first superheroes are the Doom Patrol. If your first major superhero is Captain America, that's going to give a different vibe than your first superhero being Batman. If the most well-known superhero in the world is Superman, then the world is going to see superheroes very differently than if he is Homelander. And then you have, how was it spun? How did they pretend that person was for you to feel how you feel about them, right? So there is so much potential for secrets and conspiracy and left, right, and continuous different takes. You really have to put some thought into it when you're building a modern game, especially in the superheroic and supernatural genres. And you can see there's so much overlap between these two that it's not even funny, which is why I lumped them together for this short series. So it's really, this episode has been about the big picture thinking of figuring out what you want the setting to feel like and why and how it got there and what the primary focus is going to be of foes, kind of. Like, we'll get into foes and fiends and foes and friends and so on more in a later installment, but the overall feeling of the world gives you a good idea of where you're going, right? If you're playing supernatural characters, then your foes are as likely to be normal people as they are other supernaturals. If you're playing superheroic characters, are you pro-government, are you anti-government, blah, 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 helps determine what kind of fights you're going to be in and the theme and feel of the game. And when we gather together on Friday, importance of the truth versus what people believe in a superhuman or supernatural setting is a big deal. And they can be the same thing, mostly, right? Next session, I will be actually jumping down a few rungs in scope and start talking about building cities, whether from scratch, a fictional city, or changing your real world city to account for superheroics or supernaturals and where they slot into that city and how they change that city and what is involved in a specific city or area and what you should strive to do, what world building looks like at that level, right? Because there's a bunch of stuff you're going to have, possibly networks and webs of relations between various organizations. Like, you can have that on the superheroic, on the big level as well, but it becomes really important to know, how does the police commissioner or the chief of police feel about superheroes or monsters? Do they know about them, etc.? What does the mayor feel? Does the mayor belong to do any of the people in government? If people in government are controlled by any superheroic or supernatural faction, which ones are they controlled by, right? And all of these things become very important. Also, you need to think about, in both superhuman and supernatural settings, which parts of the town are particularly supernatural. What place, like in a supernatural setting, which houses are actually haunted? Which locations are actually supernaturally empowered, right? And that's where you go back to myth and folklore and urban legends in your town to figure out what sorts of things there are and where you want to put things. So we're going to be leaning hard on urban legends next session, because modern folklore, modern mythology, they're still just as valid, because they're still expressions of the ongoing folklore from beforehand. Now, ads are starting in about 18 seconds, and I am going to sign off with that. So, it has been good chatting with everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to me ramble, or at least lurking and supporting my channel. Thank you all. And